3-year-old girl kept signaling for help, but no one noticed. No one, except for a former soldier. Minutes later, he stood, and what he did next left the whole diner silent. A fly buzzed faintly against the window pane, trapped in a world it didn't understand. The Kansas sky outside was quiet, the late afternoon sun slipping past the horizon like an old promise. Inside, shadows stretched long across cracked tile and Formica booths. Ethan Walker, back straight, eyes sharp, watched it all without blinking. A Marine for 18 years, he wasn't there by chance. Neither was his dog. If you believe that some instincts never fade, and that sometimes it takes a soldier and a dog to hear what the world refuses to see, then stay. Like, subscribe, and follow this story to the end. The wind in Willow Creek didn't howl. It pressed in slow, constant, unforgiving. That morning, the frost lay thick on the pavement, and the sky hung low with heavy clouds the color of wet cement. Along Route 47, where the pines leaned in like silent watchers, the Valley Pines Diner flickered faintly beneath a crooked neon sign, half alive in the cold. Ethan Monroe pushed through the door just past 9 a.m., shaking off the chill. Tall, broad, with a quiet intensity that never left his shoulders, Ethan moved like someone trained to expect trouble. His green military coat was frayed at the edges, his boots worn, his silence deeper than most people's conversation. Ranger followed closely behind. The 4-year-old German Shepherd was lean, alert, and built like a coiled spring. His black and tan coat shimmered faintly with melted frost, and his gaze swept the room before he settled at Ethan's side. Never too far, never fully relaxed. Inside, the diner was warm, but not cozy. The heater coughed above the door. A trucker snored gently over his coffee in the corner. 2 teenagers argued softly over a crossword. Behind the counter, Rosie Delgado glanced up. She was in her 40s, with a no-nonsense bun and sharp eyes softened by long years in the same town. "Didn't expect to see you back," she said, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Didn't expect to stop," Ethan replied, taking a booth by the window. She poured the coffee. "That dog of yours still doesn't like waffles?" "He doesn't like syrup," Ethan said. Ranger sat under the table, unmoving, but his ears flicked. A second later, he let out a low, quiet growl. Ethan paused, mug halfway to his lips. "What is it?" Ranger didn't break his stare. His eyes were fixed on the far end of the diner. That's when Ethan saw her. A little girl, maybe 3 or 4, sat quietly in a corner booth, nearly hidden by a broken jukebox. She wore a red winter coat too large for her frame, her pale hands folded neatly in her lap. Her light blonde curls were tied back with a faded pink ribbon. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her eyes, gray-blue and distant, were fixed on nothing and everything all at once. Across from her sat a man, mid-40s, sharply dressed in a gray wool coat, blonde hair combed back with care. He read from a book with no title. His posture was stiff. He never looked at the child. Something in Ethan's chest tightened. The pancakes in front of the girl were untouched. She didn't speak. She didn't fidget. Then, as if prompted by instinct, her gaze landed on Ethan. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted one hand and made a small, almost imperceptible motion, opening and closing her fist. Once, twice, 3 times. Ethan didn't react, but inside, everything went still. He leaned slightly toward the counter. "Rosie," he said quietly, "that man and the girl, you know them?" She followed his gaze. "Nope. Came in maybe 20 minutes ago. He ordered for her, but she hasn't said a word." "Has she eaten anything?" Rosie hesitated. "I don't think so." Ethan nodded slowly. Ranger remained still, but his tail curled tight. The air in the diner hadn't changed, but the mood had shifted. The man glanced up once briefly, almost lazily, just enough to see if anyone was paying attention. He didn't look at the girl. She looked again at Ethan. One hand moved, open, close, open. Her face showed no fear, but her eyes were searching, pleading. Ranger stood. Ethan didn't say a word, but he knew in that moment this was no longer a stop on the way. This was why he'd come. Ranger took one step forward from under the booth. He didn't bark or lunge, just moved, slow and deliberate, toward the little girl across the diner, as if he were drawn by a thread no one else could see. Ethan's hand lightly touched the top of his head, a silent signal to hold. But Ranger's body was already tense, ears forward, eyes locked on the child. The girl hadn't moved since she'd given the signal. Her hand now rested stiffly in her lap, her small shoulders squared like she was bracing herself for something. Her eyes, pale and searching, returned to Ethan's for the third time in 2 minutes. He didn't need more. He rose from the booth, coffee untouched, and walked calmly toward the counter. Behind it, Rosie was stacking clean plates on a wire shelf, humming faintly to a tune coming from the ceiling speaker. Her eyes flicked up at his approach. "Rosie," Ethan said quietly, "you still got that old landline in the back?" She nodded, her expression shifting. "Yeah, but we don't use it much." "Can I?" he asked, already rounding the counter. She didn't stop him. Something in his voice, low, even made her pulse slow. Rosie had known Ethan long enough to know when something was wrong. In the narrow space behind the counter, Ethan paused by the swinging door that led to the storage room. He looked back to where the girl was sitting. She hadn't touched her food. The man still hadn't spoken to her. Instead, he reached for a napkin and dabbed at his mouth. Though he hadn't eaten either, his movements were precise, calculated, like someone playing the role of a traveling guardian, but failing to rehearse the most basic lines. Ethan stepped into the storage room, where the lights flickered softly above stacks of bulk napkins and canned soup. The landline hung on the wall next to the breaker box. He dialed. After 2 rings, a voice picked up. Willow Creek Sheriff's Department, Deputy Sarah Caldwell speaking. Sarah's voice was steady, low-pitched, almost tired. She was in her early 50s, tall and lean, with crow's feet at the corners of her eyes and hair pulled back in a loose ponytail that had long since gone from chestnut to salt and pepper. Known for her sharp instincts and sharp tongue, Sarah had served the county for over 20 years. Her calmness came from seeing more pain than she ever talked about. Her only daughter had gone missing at 17. Never found, never fully grieved. That event had chiseled her into a quiet blade, efficient, deeply perceptive, and emotionally impenetrable. "This is Ethan Monroe," he said. "I'm at Valley Pines Diner. There's a situation." He explained quickly. The little girl, the man in the suit, the SOS signal, Ranger's reaction. Sarah listened without interrupting. "You're sure it was the distress signal?" she asked. "I'm positive," Ethan said. 3 times, deliberate, clear. There was a brief pause, the kind that didn't mean doubt but judgment. "Don't engage yet," she said. "I'm sending someone now. Stay close. Observe." Ethan hung up. When he returned to the dining area, the man and the girl were still there. But now the man was looking around, slowly, casually. His eyes passed over Rosie, over the window, over Ranger. Then they landed on Ethan and stayed there. Ethan didn't flinch. He walked back to his booth and sat, posture open, gaze neutral. But his heart was already calculating the exits, the angles, the time it would take to move 10 feet if things turned fast. Ranger had lain back down but hadn't relaxed. His ears twitched at every small sound. The girl looked at him again. This time, Ethan smiled, just slightly, and the girl's hand moved again. Fist, open, 1, 2, 3. The man noticed. He reached across the table, not to strike, but to place his hand on the girl's. It was slow, smooth, but she recoiled. Just a fraction of an inch. Enough. Rosie returned from the kitchen, holding a tray of fresh apple pie slices. She glanced toward the booth, her brow furrowing. As she passed Ethan's table, she whispered, "You okay?" "Call Sarah back," he said under his breath. "Tell her the man made contact." The girl flinched. Rosie nodded, nearly imperceptibly, then walked to the counter like nothing had happened. Meanwhile, a new customer walked in. The bell jingled as the door opened and closed quickly behind a gust of wind. A man in his 60s, tall but slightly hunched, in a dark brown parka and orange wool beanie, stomped the snow off his boots and looked around. His name was Marvin Keller, a retired freight driver with a habit of making morning stops for coffee and a newspaper. Quiet, gentle, slightly deaf in one ear, Marvin often wandered into conversations uninvited, but never maliciously. "Hey, Rosie," he called. "You got any of that pecan pie left from yesterday?" "Back corner of the fridge," she said, without turning around. Marvin took a stool at the counter, blissfully unaware of the tension building in the room. The man in the suit stood up. He didn't speak. He just straightened his coat, smoothed his collar, and gently gestured for the girl to follow. She hesitated. Her tiny hands clutched the edge of the booth. Ethan stood too, no rush, no aggression, just steady mirrored movement. "Sir," he said casually, "leaving so soon?" The man turned. His face was calm, but his eyes had gone sharp. "Is there a problem?" "She looks cold," Ethan said, eyes dropping briefly to the girl's coat. "You sure she's okay?" "She's fine," the man replied. "She's my niece. We're traveling." "Funny," Ethan said. "She hasn't said a word the whole time. Hasn't eaten either." The man gave a smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "She's shy, long trip. You know how kids get." Ranger rose. His growl this time was not subtle. The girl jumped. Behind the counter, Rosie picked up the phone again. Outside, the wind pressed against the diner windows. Snow flurried. Everything else inside was holding its breath. Then the girl moved. Not toward the man, but a half step back, away. The man didn't like that. He reached for her wrist, and Ranger barked. Once. Loud. Deep. Everyone turned. Ethan's voice was low. "You want to let go of her now?" The man froze, just for a second. The door opened. Deputy Sarah Caldwell entered, her badge clipped to a thick gray vest, one hand resting on the radio at her belt. Her gaze swept the room in half a second, taking it all in. She didn't need to ask. "Step away from the child," she said calmly. The man opened his mouth but didn't argue. Instead, he slowly released the girl's wrist and raised both hands. "I haven't done anything," he said. "You people are making a mistake." Sarah didn't blink. "Maybe, but we're going to clear that up downtown. Ethan, would you mind sitting with the girl for a moment?" The girl turned to Ethan. Her lips didn't move. But her eyes, those eyes no longer searched. They had found something. Ranger stepped beside her and sat, his body blocking hers from the man completely. Sarah moved in, handcuffed the man without a word. Rosie set down the pie tray with a quiet sigh. Outside, the siren of the backup cruiser approached in the distance. The girl's name was still unknown. But Ethan had seen her. Ranger had felt her. And that had been enough. The cruiser's red and blue lights cast long, shifting shadows across the front of the Valley Pines diner, painting its snow-dusted windows in brief pulses of color. Inside, the air was still tense, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what had just happened. But the man in the gray suit was gone now, handcuffed and taken into custody by Deputy Sarah Caldwell and her team. The child, still without a name, sat quietly at the corner booth, flanked by Ethan and Ranger, who stood like a sentinel by her side. Rosie Delgado brought over a warm blanket and gently draped it around the little girl's shoulders. The girl didn't speak or look up, but allowed the blanket to rest. Her small fingers tightened on the edges of the fabric, knuckles pale with effort. Ethan looked across the table at Rosie. "You said they were here before I came in?" She nodded, folding her arms and leaning lightly against the back of the nearby booth. "Yeah. I was in the kitchen for most of it, but when I came out to refill coffee, they were already there. He ordered for her. She didn't say a word, barely moved." Rosie paused. "I thought she might be sick, or just tired from travel. That was an hour ago." Her eyes flicked to the girl. "She's too still, Ethan. That's not just shy, that's scared." "I know," he said quietly. Outside, snow was starting to fall in slow, gentle flakes. The wind had eased, but the temperature was dropping. The world felt muted. Ranger remained still, but his head turned slightly toward the front windows. His ears perked, and his body shifted with intention. Ethan followed his gaze. The gray SUV was still parked near the utility pole, engine off now, but fresh tracks in the snow betrayed that it had been recently moved. No one stood nearby, but something about it, too clean, too quiet, made Ranger stiffen. "I'm going out for a minute," Ethan said. Rosie opened her mouth to speak, but stopped. She simply nodded. Ranger was already at the door before Ethan grabbed his coat. As they stepped outside, the wind cut sharper than before, pushing through Ethan's sleeves as he crossed the lot. The SUV loomed in the snow, its surface slick and reflecting the diner's soft lights. Ranger approached it with practiced precision, nose twitching, tail low, shoulders taut. Ethan walked around the vehicle slowly. He peered through the windows. No child seat. No toys, nothing that suggested a family car. The back seat was empty, but the floor had crumbs and a juice box wrapper. Not recent, maybe weeks old. Ranger sniffed near the driver's side, then suddenly moved to the rear passenger door. He stopped, then growled. Not the kind of growl that meant curiosity. The kind that meant something was wrong. "Good boy," Ethan murmured, kneeling beside him. He pulled out his phone and snapped a few photos of the license plate, then circled back to the front passenger side. There, in the soft snow, was a faint indentation like someone had been kneeling. A set of smaller footprints overlapped nearby. Ethan frowned. Behind him, a low crunch of boots on snow made him turn. Sarah Caldwell was walking up from her cruiser, hands in the pockets of her vest, breath visible in the cold. "You followed your dog?" she asked. "He followed the truth," Ethan replied. Sarah bent to examine the area where Ranger had stopped. She said nothing for a moment, then nodded. "We'll have it impounded. My deputy's calling it in now." Ethan looked at her. "You got somewhere safe to take the girl?" Sarah's expression shifted. "Yeah. There's a child advocate named Kim Thatcher, lives near the station, works with trauma cases. I already called her." He nodded. "She's gonna need someone like that." As they walked back toward the diner, a small pickup truck rolled into the lot and parked by the side. A woman stepped out, tall and thin, mid-30s, with strawberry blonde hair pulled into a tight braid, and a dark wool peacoat buttoned up to her chin. She moved with calm, practiced care, her steps purposeful, not hurried. This was Kim Thatcher. Inside, Rosie had gently coaxed the girl into sipping warm milk. Ranger had taken his place once more at Ethan's side, but his attention never wavered from the windows. The girl wrapped in the blanket sat, hunched but still. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, but her hand no longer trembled. Kim stepped inside, bringing with her a burst of cold air and quiet authority. She wasn't the kind of woman who talked over others or used big gestures. Her strength came from stillness. Years working as a therapist for foster children had made her eyes deep wells of patience. She crouched beside the girl without touching her. "Hi, sweetheart," Kim said gently. "I'm Kim. I'm here to take you somewhere safe, just for a little while. Would that be okay?" The girl didn't answer, but she looked at Ranger. The dog stood, walked over, and nudged her hand with his nose. She didn't pull away. She looked up at Ethan. He knelt. "It's all right," he said softly. "She's a friend. She's gonna help." For the first time, the girl moved on her own. She nodded, barely, but it was there. Kim held out a small plush toy from her coat pocket, a faded stuffed fox stitched at the ears. "You can hold this if you like. He's good at keeping secrets." The girl reached out and took it. Her hand gripped it tightly. "Do you have a name?" Kim asked. The girl hesitated. Then, in a voice barely more than a breath, she said, "June." Rosie let out a gasp she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "June." Sarah stepped forward. "We'll start running her name through the system. Missing persons, school records, hospitals." Ethan stood beside Kim and watched June be gently lifted into a warm blanket, still holding the stuffed fox. The girl looked back once at Ranger, and for the first time, she smiled, just a little. That night, the SUV was towed. June was taken to Kim's house for care and evaluation. And Ethan? He stayed behind with Ranger, standing quietly beside Rosie outside the diner as the snow began to fall in earnest. "She looked at you like she knew you'd find her," Rosie said. Ethan said nothing, but he was thinking the same thing. Outside, the snowfall thickened into a quiet curtain of white, covering the streets of Willow Creek like a secret waiting to be uncovered. The flashing police lights had faded, but inside Valley Pine's diner, the aftershock remained. Ethan sat back at the window booth, his coat still on, eyes scanning the lot through the steamed glass. Ranger lay at his feet, his breathing even, but ears twitching at the softest sound. The coffee in front of Ethan had long since gone cold. Rosie had tried to reheat it twice, but he didn't touch it. His focus remained locked on the door, and on what hadn't been said. Ranger hadn't taken his eyes off the SUV, even after it was towed. That meant something. And when Ranger refused to settle, neither did Ethan. June was now safe, somewhere across town in Kim Thatcher's home, curled beneath soft blankets with that stitched-up fox in her arms. But safe didn't mean over. Sarah Caldwell returned just past 6 p.m. Her cruiser pulled into the lot slowly, headlights barely cutting through the thick snowflakes now falling in diagonal lines. She stepped out in her heavy deputy coat, the Willow Creek Sheriff's badge dulled from years of use. Her face, angular and lined with quiet strength, showed a rare weariness. She walked into the diner with snow still clinging to her shoulders. "We got a name," she said, not waiting for coffee or conversation. "His license was fake, but we got a match on his prints. Gregory Kane, arrested in 2009 for fraud, questioned in a child custody case in 2017, slipped out of both." Ethan leaned back. "That's not all he's done?" Sarah nodded grimly. "We think June may not be his first. She wasn't listed as missing, no official reports, no school enrollment. That tells me someone silenced her story before it could be told." "What about the SUV?" he asked. "Wiped clean," she said. "But Ranger sniffing at that back seat wasn't wrong. Forensics found fibers, small ones. We'll compare them to June's coat, but we're betting they match." Ranger gave a short huff, as if in confirmation. Sarah turned toward him. "He's good," she said simply. Ethan looked down. "He doesn't forget anything." Rosie brought over a tray with fresh mugs and a plate of cornbread she'd just warmed in the oven. "Eat something, both of you," she said, her voice motherly but firm. "You're no good to anybody on an empty stomach." Sarah sat. She rarely did, but tonight her legs gave a little more than usual. "We're pulling in state resources. Kane had an out-of-state plate on a registered rental. We think there's movement across county lines. Maybe more than one child." Ethan stared out the window, silent. Then Ranger stood. It was sudden, sharp, ears pointed toward the side lot. A low, warning growl rumbled from his chest. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her sidearm. "What is it?" Rosie asked, clutching her apron. Ethan stood too, eyes narrowing. "Movement." Sarah walked quickly to the door, cracked it open, and looked toward the dark edge of the parking lot near the dumpsters. A figure was moving through the snow, slow, unsure, weaving slightly from side to side. Ethan stepped out next, Ranger beside him. The cold hit like a slap, but he barely felt it. Snow crunched under his boots as they approached the figure. A teenage girl, thin, soaked through from the snow, her face pale and blotchy from crying, was stumbling forward. She looked no older than 15. Her name was Paige. Thin to the point of malnourishment, she wore jeans that barely clung to her hips, and a sweater several sizes too large. Her black hair was matted and clumped with snow. Her eyes wide and vacant barely registered Ethan until Ranger stepped in front of her. The dog barked once, sharp, loud. She stopped. Ethan raised his hands, soft. "It's okay. We're not here to hurt you." Paige blinked, then sobbed once, just once, before collapsing into the snow. Ethan caught her before she hit the ground. Back inside the diner, Sarah called for backup and medical. Rosie wrapped Paige in a heavy wool blanket and set her near the kitchen space heater. "She was hiding behind the dumpster," Ethan said. "Probably ran from someone, or something." Sarah crouched beside the girl, who now stared blankly at the table. "Sweetheart, my name is Sarah. Can you tell us your name?" "Paige," the girl whispered. "Paige Sutter." Ethan flinched. The name. Rosie gasped. "There's been flyers for that girl, at the post office. That's the one, isn't it?" Sarah nodded slowly. "She went missing 6 months ago from Portland." Paige looked up at Ethan. "He told me I'd never be found. He said they didn't look for the last one either." Ethan's blood ran cold. "He?" Sarah pressed gently. Paige shivered. "The man, Gregory, he said we were going to get another girl soon, that the quiet ones were easier to keep." The room fell into silence. Even Ranger lay down slowly, tail thumping once, like he understood the gravity of what she'd said. Sarah stood and moved to the window, her breath fogging the glass. He wasn't alone. "June," Ethan said. "She was next." "No," Paige whispered behind them. "She wasn't next. She was the last." That night, Sarah filed an emergency warrant. Every highway patrol unit in the region was alerted. Kane's connections, movements, digital trail, everything was reopened. Ranger wouldn't rest. He paced beside the booths, returning again and again to the door. When Ethan finally sat down, Ranger laid his head on Ethan's boots but kept one eye open. The storm outside howled again, louder now, like the town itself was waking up. Ethan looked at Sarah. "We missed it before." She didn't argue. He looked down at Ranger. But not this time. Snowfall still blanketed Willow Creek like a veil of silence, but inside the sheriff's office, silence had become a rare commodity. The discovery of Paige Sutter and her chilling words about Gregory Kane's intentions had transformed the case from a local rescue to the tip of something larger, organized, systematic, and terrifying. Sarah Caldwell had called in reinforcements, but more importantly, she had called Sheriff Harper Quinn. Harper arrived at the station the next morning. She stepped out of a state-issued black SUV, wearing a charcoal trench coat lined with gray wool. She was in her mid-40s, African-American, with short, tightly curled hair and a gaze that could strip lies down to the bone. Harper was known throughout Oregon for two things: her zero-tolerance stance on trafficking and her past. Her sister had vanished when they were teenagers, never found. That personal loss had carved Harper into someone unshakable. She moved like someone who did not ask for permission and didn't wait for answers. She went and got them. Inside, the station buzzed with movement. Officers reviewed timelines, combed through old records, and traced credit card charges linked to Kane. Ethan sat near the holding room, with Ranger lying beside his chair. The dog hadn't rested much through the night, waking every time a door opened, his ears constantly pivoted, body tensing with each unfamiliar voice. Sheriff Harper entered with calm authority. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Ethan. "You're Monroe?" she asked, stepping closer. "Ethan Monroe," he replied, standing. Harper nodded. "Caldwell says you picked up on things our officers missed." "I didn't," he said. "My dog did." Her eyes shifted to Ranger. "Military K-9? Search and recovery, special training and victim response. I was in CID Counterintelligence Division before I left." Harper raised a brow. "Why'd you leave?" "Too many cases that ended in body bags." She didn't blink. "Same." They both looked toward the holding cell where Gregory Kane sat, calm as ice. Clean clothes, folded hands, blank expression. "Won't say a word," Sarah murmured, joining them. "No lawyer yet. Claims innocence, says June is his niece. That Page is confused." Harper watched Kane through the glass. "He's waiting, for something or someone." Ethan nodded. "He had something in his coat. A phone, maybe. Didn't use it, just touched it like he was checking something." "I'll talk to him," Harper said. "But we'll need more than his lies to hold him. GPS, patterns, proof. We have to move before someone else picks up where he left off." Ethan stepped forward. "Let me search the SUV again, this time with Ranger. He'll find whatever they missed." Harper paused, then nodded once. "You've got 15 minutes before the vehicles move to state impound." Outside, the wind had sharpened. The gray SUV sat under a thin crust of new snow, looking unbothered, untouched. But Ethan knew better. He opened the rear door, and Ranger leapt in with a quick sniff. His nose went to the floor, then the seams, the seat back, then abruptly to the inside panel of the door. He barked once, then scratched. Ethan crouched and used a multi-tool to pry open the panel's edge. Behind the fabric was a compartment not on any standard model. A hollow cavity lined with aluminum tape and tucked inside. A thin burner phone and an SD card taped together. He held it up to the sunlight. The screen was cracked but not dead. When they returned inside, Harper had already set up a digital analysis tech. A man in his early 30s named Benny Tran, thin, bespectacled, with fingers that moved faster than his mouth. Benny was quiet, methodical, and brilliant with data. He'd once uncovered a trafficking ring across 2 states by decoding metadata inside old photos on a flip phone. "Let's see what the monster was hiding," Benny muttered, inserting the SD card. The screen lit up. Dozens of files, GPS logs, waypoints, short clips, some less than 3 seconds. One file labeled simply, "Next stop, border." Harper leaned forward. "Zoom in on that one." The screen showed a map with a plotted route leading from Willow Creek to a location straddling the Oregon-California border. It wasn't a town. It was a dead-end forest road. "Looks like a drop point," Sarah said. 3 hours south, Ethan calculated. "If someone else was coming to get June." "We need to move now," Harper said. Within 20 minutes, 2 cruisers, 1 unmarked car, and Ethan's truck were moving fast out of town. Ranger rode in the front beside Ethan, ears high, breath fogging the passenger window. The convoy stopped just before the road turned to gravel. Snow had thinned here, melting under the stronger southern sun. Ranger was out before Ethan could give the word, pulling at the leash, nose dragging across the earth like a magnet drawn to steel. "Let him go," Harper said. Ethan unclipped the lead. Ranger bounded ahead, then suddenly slowed, body crouched low. He moved along a line of bushes and stopped near a tree stump. He barked once. Sarah reached the spot first. Beneath a torn blue tarp was a second car. No plates, locked tight. Inside, blankets, a plastic food bag, zip ties, and a small pair of children's shoes, untouched. Someone was supposed to come, Harper said quietly, but June wasn't there to be delivered. We intercepted the plan, Ethan added, but that means there are others, more drop points, more children. Harper turned to Benny, who had been tracking the GPS data live. Get me the rest of the logs. I want every route, every stop, every phone tower pinged. Benny nodded, already tapping into the feed. They stood under the gray sky, still and heavy. No one spoke. Ranger sat by Ethan's leg, eyes on the tree line. Ethan's voice broke the silence. She was the last. Harper glanced over. Not if we move fast enough. And for the first time since it all began, there was a shift not in fear, but in direction. The rain came before dawn, not the sharp, icy kind that slices sideways, but a gentle, persistent drizzle that settled over Willow Creek like the sigh of something tired. It tapped on the sheriff's office windows and turned the dirt roads slick with mud. Inside, the building was quiet except for the hum of equipment and the scratch of pencil on paper. In one of the side rooms, June sat at a small table covered in colored pencils and a stack of clean white paper. Her red coat had been exchanged for a soft blue sweatshirt with a cartoon fox on the chest, and her blonde curls were tied back loosely with a ribbon that matched. The warmth in the room hadn't yet reached her shoulders. She still sat hunched, knees tucked up, hands small and uncertain. Kim Thatcher knelt beside her, the same calm presence she had been since the night June was found. Dressed in simple jeans and a long beige cardigan, Kim radiated safety. She never asked too many questions. She didn't rush. She simply made space for the child to exist. Across the hallway, Ethan stood by the observation window, arms crossed, watching through the glass. Ranger sat beside him, tail curled, eyes sharp and steady. The dog had barely left June's side for more than a few minutes at a time, and even now, he twitched every time June shifted. June hadn't spoken since revealing her name. She hadn't cried, hadn't made a sound, until now. She reached across the table for a yellow crayon, then paused. Slowly, almost uncertainly, she touched Ranger's head through the open door. He lifted his nose and licked her fingers once. That was all it took. Her shoulders shook, her eyes filled. She wept. Not loudly, not violently, but like a tide she could no longer hold back. Kim wrapped an arm gently around her. No words, just warmth. And then, with trembling hands, June picked up the crayon and began to draw. Ethan stepped back from the glass. She's remembering, Kim said softly when she stepped out moments later. Not in sentences, but in shapes. Sarah Caldwell joined them, her gray vest damp from the rain, clipboard tucked under one arm. She looked tired. Dark circles had formed beneath her eyes, but her movements were still crisp. What did she draw? Sarah asked. Kim hesitated. A house with one window boarded up, a woman lying on a couch, eyes closed, and a man outside the door with something in his hand. She drew it twice. Same scene. Ethan's jaw tightened. The woman? I think it's her mother. Harper Quinn arrived then, umbrella folded, coat damp. Where's the picture? Kim handed her the page. Harper stared at it for a long moment, then turned it over. There was a second drawing. This one showed a van gray boxy next to a small building marked with a red X. 3 stick figures stood beside it, 2 tall, 1 small. The smallest had yellow hair. She remembers everything, Harper said quietly. She just didn't have the words. Sarah turned to Benny Tran, who had been quietly decoding more GPS logs in the background. Benny had an almost monk-like demeanor when he worked, always focused, always silent, but his eyes gleamed with information. I think I found the connection, he said. Kane's previous GPS history matches 3 known drop locations across Oregon, including one linked to a cold case from 2020 in Jackson County. Ethan looked up. That the case with the missing boy Caleb Roan? Benny nodded. That's the one, never solved. But Kane's route passed the cabin within a 2-hour window. Harper narrowed her eyes. So, we've got a pattern, a network. We may have more, Sarah said, flipping through her notes. June's last known medical visit was in Seattle, registered under a different last name. The woman who brought her in claimed to be her aunt. No ID was verified, but the woman matches Kane's known associate Vanessa Pike. At the mention of the name, Ranger growled low. Ethan glanced down. He knows it. Harper turned to Kim. Does June recognize that name? We haven't said it aloud, Kim replied, but I can try. She returned to June's side with a small stuffed bear and placed it on the table. Gently she said, June, have you ever met someone named Vanessa? June's hand stopped moving. She looked down at the bear. Then, without a word, she picked up the red crayon and scribbled across the bear's chest. Fast, hard strokes, until the page tore slightly beneath the pressure. That was enough. Ethan stood. She's the one who took her. Sarah flipped through the database. Vanessa Pike, last known address, Salem. Suspicion of aiding in illegal adoptions back in 2018, but never charged. We need eyes on her, Harper said. Now. Within the hour, officers were dispatched to Vanessa's last known residence. Meanwhile, Ranger began pacing again, circling back to the conference room where June sat. Harper watched the dog. He's restless. He knows something's still coming, Ethan said. That evening, June added a new drawing to her stack. It showed two dogs, one standing beside a small girl with yellow hair, the other lying beneath a tree, eyes closed. Do you know what that means? Kim asked gently. June pointed to the dog beneath the tree, then to Ranger. Kim blinked. That was before or after? June didn't speak, but she drew a small sun above Ranger, and a cloud over the other. Later that night, Harper stood outside the station watching the rain turn to sleet. Ethan joined her, coffee in hand. She remembers everything, he said. Harper nodded. And she might be the only one who can prove Vanessa's involvement. Then we keep her safe. We keep them all safe. Inside, Ranger curled up beside June's chair, his head resting against her foot. For the first time, she reached down and scratched behind his ear. The storm passed overnight, leaving Willow Creek in a hush that felt both clean and haunting. Snow had dusted the hills above town, giving the evergreens a sugar-white frosting, but the streets below remained slick with leftover slush. At Valley Pines Diner, the windows fogged gently from the warmth inside, where Rosie Bennett poured a fresh pot of coffee for a quiet morning crowd that wasn't quite ready to talk. Rosie, in her early 50s, had one of those faces you could read like a book lined from years of laughter. Lips often pursed with concern, but eyes always observant. Her ash blonde hair was tied up in a frizzy bun under her Valley Pines ball cap, and she wore her usual faded apron embroidered with "Coffee first, judgment later." She'd been serving pancakes, small-town gossip, and strong opinions in this diner since she was 20, and nothing much got past her. So, when Sheriff Harper Quinn returned to the diner that morning, Rosie met her with a grave nod and a hand already reaching for the good mug, the one not chipped. "I've been thinking," Rosie said, pouring Harper a cup without asking. "That fella Kane, was it? The one you cuffed outside yesterday, he's been here before." Harper straightened. "You're sure?" Rosie didn't blink. "Not once or twice either. 4, maybe 5 times over the last year. Always with a little girl, but never the same one." The words felt like a dropped stone in cold water. Harper leaned in. "Describe them." Rosie closed her eyes for a second, as if flipping through an old mental photo album. One was maybe 6, freckles, always clinging to a worn pink bunny. Another had jet black hair, barely said a word. I didn't think much of it. Figured maybe he was fostering or something. But now I feel sick about it. Harper jotted quick notes. "Can you remember what vehicle he drove those times?" "Same one as yesterday. Gray Chevy Suburban, Oregon plates, but he once asked directions headed into Idaho." Harper's jaw tightened. "I'm going to need you to come with me and repeat this to our investigator. You may have just cracked this thing wide open." Back at the sheriff's office, the pieces began falling into place like ice thawing on a windshield. Benny Tran, with his usual quiet intensity, worked 3 monitors at once. His fingers flew as he cross-referenced Kane's plate number, public surveillance data, and missing children reports. Across the room, Ethan sat with Ranger sprawled at his feet, the shepherd's ears occasionally twitching toward the commotion. Despite the relative calm, Ranger remained alert, as if the silence itself was a warning. "You might want to hear this," Benny called over. "There's a pattern. Harper stepped beside him. On his screen, he'd mapped Kane's movements over the past year, looping between Oregon, Idaho, and Washington. Each dot corresponded to a small town or highway rest stop. Many of them had open or cold case reports of missing children. "Dear God," Sarah murmured from behind. She wore her fatigue visibly today. No makeup, hair hastily pinned back, and her usual fitted blouse exchanged for a loose gray sweater. The edges of her clipboard were bent, pages curling slightly from overuse. Benny continued. Cross-referencing Rosie's memory, "I've got 3 potential matches to missing persons reports filed in separate counties. But here's where it gets interesting. Yesterday, Ranger found a piece of fabric under Kane's SUV, dirty, snagged in the undercarriage. I ran a rapid DNA match. He clicked, and a new profile opened. Amber Velez, age 5, missing from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, 4 months ago." Harper went silent. Even Ranger stood. "That dog," Benny added, voice shaking slightly, "just solved a case the FBI's been stuck on for a quarter." Ethan bent to rub behind Ranger's ear. "Good boy." Outside the building, news spread fast. Local media vans circled like moths by noon. The station phones rang non-stop. For a town like Willow Creek, where the biggest headlines usually involve stray livestock or bake sale fraud, this was beyond anything they'd ever known. Harper knew the danger now wasn't just about what had happened, but what might be happening still. She made calls to neighboring counties, pulled in extra units, and set up a temporary task force headquartered right at the sheriff's office. One of the new arrivals was Detective Emmett Grayson from Boise Land, sharp-jawed, mid-40s, with dark hair streaked at the temples and a voice like sandpaper. Emmett had worked trafficking cases for over a decade. He shook Ethan's hand firmly when they met. "Your dog's the real deal," Emmett said. "He's why I'm here." Ethan shrugged. "I just follow his lead." Emmett flipped through files. "We've got an active ring operating with medical forgeries, fake guardianship papers, interstate movement, maybe even international. Kane was low-tier muscle, but he was reliable. If we spook them, they'll scatter." Back inside, June had remained quiet most of the day, curled beside Ranger with a small blanket and the stuffed fox Kim had given her. Her cheeks were less pale now, the shadows under her eyes lightening slowly. At one point, Kim returned with apple slices and a tiny cup of peanut butter. June accepted them silently, then pointed at the news ticker on the muted TV. A picture of Kane. She picked up a red crayon and drew a large X over his face. Then, for the first time that day, she spoke. "Don't let him get another girl." The room froze. Sarah knelt beside her. "We won't, sweetie, I promise. You've helped us more than you know." That evening, in a small press conference held just outside the station, Sheriff Harper stepped to the microphone with Ethan and Ranger by her side. "Thanks to the vigilance of citizens, the bravery of this child, and the extraordinary instincts of this retired service dog," Harper said, "we've uncovered a multi-state trafficking ring, and we're only just beginning." Ranger stood tall beside her, head high. Someone from the back shouted, "He's a hero!" Applause broke out. June watched from the window, small hand pressed to the glass. She smiled, not wide, not free, but real. The past had returned, yes. But so had the fight. Winter's grip slowly loosened its hold on Willow Creek as February tipped into March. Snow still lingered along the edges of roads and rooftops, but the sharp bite in the wind had mellowed. The sky, once gray and oppressive, began to carry a faint softness light blue, streaked with the whispers of spring. Inside a modest craftsman-style house just off Cedar Lane, Harper Quinn stood quietly by the window, watching as June pressed her nose to the glass, giggling at a squirrel darting through the yard. The house, once filled with silence and old shadows, now echoed with cautious laughter and footsteps that didn't tiptoe. Harper was in her early 40s, tall and slender, with pale Irish skin that blushed easily, and auburn hair usually tied back in a practical twist. Her sharp green eyes, often associated with a no-nonsense demeanor in the sheriff's uniform, had softened lately, especially around June. Beneath her composed exterior was a woman who had endured more grief than most. 3 years ago, she'd lost her only child, a 6-year-old boy named Eli, to a drunk driving accident. Since then, she'd buried herself in work, never letting herself believe she'd open her heart again. Until June. June, now comfortably nestled into her new life, wore a pale yellow sweater and mismatched socks. Her hair was freshly washed, loosely curled, and held back with a simple pink clip. She still rarely spoke in full sentences, but her drawings had become richer, full of color, motion, and tiny scribbled captions. Ranger was in almost all of them, sometimes drawn with wings. It had been just under 3 weeks since the day at Valley Pines, and in that time, the paperwork had moved faster than expected. When June had reached out to Harper unprompted, whispering, "Can I stay with you, Sheriff Lady?" No one in the room had questioned what should happen next. Harper had nodded through the tears and said, "Only if I can call you family." At the precinct, things were shifting too. Ethan sat in a newly painted office that didn't feel like his, yet walls a warm beige, with boxes still taped shut around the edges. Ranger lay curled near the heater, tail occasionally flicking in sleep. A badge sat on the desk, polished but unofficial. K-9 Training Officer, Ethan Cole. Ethan had taken weeks to agree to Harper's offer. His past, worn like a coat too heavy for spring, hadn't been easy to shed. For years he'd kept to himself after the death of his unit in Afghanistan, retreating to a life of minimal contact, minimal pain. It was Ranger, his war companion, turned therapy partner, who pulled him through. But something about June, and the way Harper looked at him without pity, had begun to undo the locks he hadn't realized were still in place. He was back, not just in title, but in purpose. That morning, a group of young recruits from the Tri-County K-9 program gathered outside the field lot behind the station. Most had never worked with service dogs before. Some were excited, others nervous. Ethan stood before them in a dark navy jacket, calm and steady, with a whistle around his neck. "You don't train a dog to love," he said simply. "But if you earn their trust, they'll teach you more about loyalty than any manual ever could." As if on cue, Ranger trotted up, tail high, eyes bright. The recruits straightened, one even applauded softly. Among the group was Officer Carmen J., a 32-year-old Hispanic woman with short black curls, square shoulders, and a stubborn streak. A former Marine-turned-cop, she was quick-witted, skeptical, and had initially clashed with Ethan during orientation. "Never thought I'd learn from a guy who looked like he'd rather be fishing," she'd muttered that first week. But now, as she watched Ranger obey a silent command with elegant precision, even she gave a respectful nod. Back at the house, Harper watched June and Ranger in the backyard through the kitchen window. The dog, ever patient, let the little girl drape him in a blanket like a king's cape. Her small voice, more confident now, narrated a fantasy. Sir Ranger saves the Cloud Castle. A knock at the door pulled Harper from the moment. It was Kim, a caseworker with the state, petite and meticulous, with horn-rimmed glasses and the soft voice of someone who'd seen too much but still hoped for the best. "Got your final placement approval," Kim said, handing Harper a manila folder. "It's all official now. June Quinn. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" Harper smiled. "It really does." Kim glanced toward the backyard. "She's different with you. She's healing." Harper nodded. "So am I." Later that evening, they had a small celebration, a modest dinner with Ethan, Ranger, and a few close precinct friends. Rosie from the diner had brought pie, even though she swore she hated baking. Benny came with a tiny Lego police station wrapped in brown paper for June. Carmen showed up awkwardly with a giant squeaky toy for Ranger. The living room felt alive. Music played faintly. Laughter returned in little bursts. At one point, June stood in the center, holding her drawing pad. She turned to Ethan and after a long pause asked, "Will you teach other doggies to be like Ranger?" Ethan knelt. "That's the plan, kiddo." She nodded solemnly, then hugged him tight. He didn't pull away. Harper watched from the kitchen doorway, her chest tight. Not from grief, but from the fragile bloom of something new. Hope. Sometimes God's miracles come in the quietest ways. A child's small gesture, a loyal dog's instinct, or a stranger who simply chooses to care. This story is a gentle reminder that faith lives in everyday moments, and that even the smallest signal for help can be answered. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Comment Amen if you believe God still works through kindness. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories of quiet grace. May God bless you always.